She broke her vow, and Rome buried her alive. He played his lyre as lions tore him apart mid-song. The crowd cheered, the priests took notes, the emperor smiled. For Rome, justice was never blind. It was choreographed. From the temple to the arena, punishment became performance. And when cruelty became sacred, the people forgot it was cruelty at all. If you value the record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. In the heart of Rome, beneath the marble calm of its temples, justice was not a debate, it was an event. The empire called it purity, but what it built was ritualized obedience. Every sentence, every death carried a script. Pain wasn't random, it was deliberate, measured, and witnessed. When a Vestal Virgin broke her vow, the city held its breath. She was led through the forum in silence, veiled, untouched, because no Roman could lay hands on something holy. A narrow stairway opened into the earth. Inside waited a small cell, a couch, a lamp, a loaf of bread. Then the stone slab closed. No screaming, no blood. Just the slow, sacred suffocation of a woman buried alive for the city's purity. To the Romans, this wasn't murder. It was maintenance, an offering to keep the divine machinery of the state from breaking. The crowd returned home assured. Justice had been done, the gods appeased. A century later, that same city would cheer as another ritual unfolded, this time in sunlight. A condemned man stood dressed as Orpheus, holding a lyre. Music filled the arena, soft, trembling, almost human in its defiance. When the lions were released, he didn't run. The sound broke mid-note. The audience rose, roaring louder than the beasts. Some crossed themselves, others threw flowers. The priests recorded the names of those who died in accordance with myth. This was not the madness of cruelty. It was its perfection. Pain had become an art form, refined through repetition, rehearsed across generations. And those who watched no longer saw a man or a woman, only symbols, roles in a civic drama that kept the empire feeling pure. What made Rome terrifying wasn't its appetite for blood. It was its calm, the composure with which it justified every execution as a sacred necessity. Its rulers didn't simply kill to punish. They killed to remind everyone what order looked like. Justice, in Rome, was beauty controlled, and beauty demanded witnesses. The amphitheater, like the temple before it, became a place of worship, where mercy had no seat. By the end of the 1st century, no one questioned it anymore. Not the priest who prayed before the killings, not the architect who designed better drains for the blood, not the mothers who held their children high to watch virtue triumph over sin. Rome had perfected the quietest form of horror, the kind wrapped in ceremony, adorned with gold, applauded by the faithful. And somewhere, beneath the roar of approval, the last whisper of guilt was buried too. In the beginning, Roman law was not about fairness. It was about balance. Every crime was seen as a fracture in the sacred order, a crack between mortals and gods. The task of justice was not to repair the victim, but to appease the divine. And to appease the divine, something, or someone, had to bleed. The 12 Tables, Rome's earliest code of law, read less like legislation and more like liturgy. Each offense came with its own ritual of repayment. Break a limb, lose one in return, speak blasphemy, forfeit your tongue, betray the gods, surrender your body to the state. There was no notion of rehabilitation, only purification through suffering. This idea, that pain could cleanse, became the moral foundation of Roman authority. The Republic built prisons, yes, but they were never meant to hold. They were waiting rooms for death, chambers for those who had already been judged unworthy of belonging to the living. The law itself was written in a tone of divine distance. Whoever has offended the gods, let him be offered to them. That line, carved in early bronze tablets, turned execution into worship. It stripped violence of guilt and replaced it with duty. Soldiers, priests, magistrates, all became participants in a single ritual economy, taking life to preserve order. When the Vestal Virgins were chosen as girls, they were told their bodies were Rome's altar. Their chastity wasn't virtue, it was infrastructure. The city's fortune depended on their untouched state, as though each heartbeat kept the empire in harmony with heaven. So when one fell in love, or even rumored to, her punishment was never personal, it was civic. The ceremony of burial was chillingly methodical. She was washed, dressed in white, crowned with flowers, and led through the forum by the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest, often the same man who advised the Senate. Crowds watched in reverence, not rage. No one screamed, no one wept aloud, because in Rome, compassion was blasphemy when directed at the condemned. At the edge of the city, she was lowered into a small underground chamber with food, water, oil, and a lamp. Tokens of mercy that allowed Rome to claim her death was in the hands of the gods. The passage was sealed with earth, and the crowd dispersed, cleansed by her silence. The Pontifex then made an offering at the altar, a prayer for balance restored. The paradox was complete. Innocence had to die to prove that purity still existed. This logic spread everywhere. Thieves were whipped not because their theft hurt citizens, but because it offended Fortuna, the goddess of luck, who abandoned the honest. Perjurers were hurled from cliffs because their false oaths polluted Jupiter's ears. Runaway slaves were branded not for disobedience, but to remind others that rebellion was contagion. Each punishment was more than deterrence. It was theatre reinforcing theology. Law wasn't human, it was cosmic. And as law turned divine, mercy turned treason. The most disturbing part was how naturally it all fit. The rituals were beautiful. Processions, incense, chants, even music. The condemned often walked calmly, knowing their death would make the city clean. The crowd would watch in silence, some whispering prayers, others studying the officials to learn the correct posture of reverence. To disapprove was to question the gods. To question was to risk joining the condemned. Fear became faith, and faith became obedience. The Romans had invented something new: bureaucratic cruelty. Every stroke of the lash, every branding iron, every public hanging was documented, accounted for, approved by law. Justice was not rage, it was administration. By the late Republic, this sacred cruelty began to fuse with politics. Senators who opposed decrees were charged with impiety. Soldiers who deserted were crucified, not as criminals, but as offerings to Mars, the god of war. Even executions in private houses were conducted with ritual precision. A servant gagged, a lamp extinguished, a whispered prayer before the blade fell. For a civilization that prided itself on order, this was the ultimate control mechanism. The state did not need to terrorize through chaos. It terrorized through procedure. Every punishment reaffirmed the same message. Pain keeps the gods watching. Pain keeps the world in balance. And once that belief took hold, the crowd no longer saw cruelty, only duty. A mother could watch her son whipped to death and whisper, "May the gods forgive him." A magistrate could sign an execution order and sleep soundly, believing he had served both justice and heaven. This is how Rome's legal system achieved its dark perfection. A world where morality was inverted, where the sacred demanded suffering, and the righteous learned to look away. The legacy of that idea still haunts us. That punishment, when given ritual and reason, can look almost beautiful. That obedience, when wrapped in faith, can make cruelty feel like order. The first stones of the Colosseum had not yet been laid, but the mindset, that mixture of devotion and detachment, was already there, carved deep into Roman hearts long before into Roman marble. The empire was learning how to discipline emotion, how to aestheticize pain, and it would soon discover that a silent crowd could be even more powerful than an army. Because once a people learn to worship punishment, they no longer need to be ruled by force. They rule themselves through fear. At dawn, the city stirred to the rhythm of ritual. Priests swept temple floors, magistrates donned crimson sashes, slaves carried water to cleanse the altars. Justice, in Rome, began every day like worship. It smelled of smoke, of oil, of iron. And in that choreography of duty, the boundary between religion and law disappeared completely. When a criminal was sentenced, the court didn't simply declare guilt, it performed it. The accused knelt before the fasces, the bound rods and axe that symbolized state power, while scribes recorded the charges on wax tablets. The presiding official would lift his hand, not as a judge, but as a priest, invoking Jupiter, Mars, or Vesta to witness the sentence. The executioner, too, had his sacred script. His tools were kept spotless. His blows were counted aloud. When the deed was done, he washed his hands in wine, a symbolic purification for both himself and the city. It wasn't vengeance. It was maintenance. And everyone present, witnesses, guards, clerks, became part of a system that made cruelty look like ceremony. In the forum, small crowds gathered around whipping posts, each strike punctuated by a clerk calling out the number, ensuring the punishment matched the decree. A few stalls away, incense burned at the altar of justice. A goddess carved with her eyes uncovered, because Roman justice was never blind. She was meant to see. She was meant to watch the pain that sustained her city. Children watched too. Fathers pointed and whispered, "That is what happens when you break the law." Fear became the first civic lesson every Roman learned. To live in Rome was to live inside an unending pageant. Processions for triumphs, sacrifices for victories, executions for transgressions. Order was not something you believed in, it was something you witnessed. The deeper the empire's faith in control grew, the more elaborate these rituals became. A thief might be flogged before a statue of Mercury, the god of trade, to symbolically return what he had stolen. Soldiers who deserted were scourged beneath the standard of their legion, so their blood might feed the spirit of the army. Every god demanded its portion of pain. Every crime had its choreography. Even silence was scripted. When a nobleman was condemned for treason, the Senate gathered in solemn quiet. No voices raised, no outrage. Only the sound of styluses scratching the verdict into record. Then the condemned was permitted to choose his death: poison, dagger, or starvation. A gesture of dignity, a final ritual of compliance. Rome taught its citizens that justice was not about right or wrong. It was about rhythm, symmetry, and spectacle. To question it was to question the harmony of the universe itself. Archaeologists have found the traces. Altars beside prison gates, offering bowls stained with iron, fragments of chains engraved with prayers. These were not tools of punishment alone, they were instruments of faith. In the Roman mind, order had to be visible. Chaos was the enemy. So, justice became performance art, not to entertain, but to remind the people that Rome was unshakable, divinely endorsed, and perpetually clean. A citizen could walk past a crucifixion, smell the blood baking in the heat, and still feel reassured. Because that death, however cruel, meant the gods were still watching, still protecting the empire. This was the moral genius of Rome. It made horror feel holy. When the Republic fell and emperors rose, they inherited this machinery already humming. A bureaucracy of ritualized violence so polished that it no longer needed justification. Augustus used it to consolidate peace. Nero used it to make a stage. Trajan used it to build loyalty. Each ruler understood the same truth. A crowd that believes it is watching righteousness will endure anything. From the daily floggings in the Forum to the solemn burials of the condemned, the empire had mastered emotional control. Every act of punishment was both instruction and reassurance that justice still lived, that Rome still stood, that the gods still approved. No one noticed when reverence turned into routine, when ritual turned into entertainment, when the smell of incense became indistinguishable from the smell of blood. And once that line blurred, there was no going back. Rome no longer feared the wrath of the gods. It had become their executor. And with that power came a terrible creativity. The same architects who designed temples began sketching amphitheaters. The same priests who buried virgins alive began blessing the sand before executions. The same crowds who once whispered prayers in silence now shouted for spectacle. The altar was ready to evolve into an arena. It began quietly, a priest's procession, a festival, a day of games to honor the gods. But soon, the line between offering and entertainment vanished. What had once been sacrifice became spectacle. Rome no longer offered victims to appease heaven. It displayed them to command the crowd. At first, the scenes were small. Criminals tied to stakes, thieves burned with torches, deserters thrown to beasts as divine punishment. Then came the amphitheaters. Vast stone lungs built to breathe awe into thousands. Every tier was hierarchy carved in marble. Senators in the shade, citizens beneath, slaves standing on the edge of dust. The design itself was theology, a living pyramid of power, with blood at the base and glory at the top. When the first arenas opened, the Senate called them munera, duties to the dead. But that word soon twisted. What began as a funeral rite for fallen generals became a public addiction. The crowd didn't come to mourn anymore. They came to feel alive. In the arena, Rome discovered its greatest invention: mass emotion. Every movement was choreographed. Trumpets blared. Incense burned. Animals were released from below by trapdoors engineered with military precision. Lions, panthers, even bears, starved for days to guarantee frenzy. The condemned were costumed as mythic figures. One man played Icarus, hurled from a tower of wood, wings collapsing mid-fall. Another, dressed as Prometheus, was chained while vultures fed on him alive. The crowd gasped, cheered, laughed. Each death followed a story they already knew. Legends turned literal. For a moment, Rome felt like Olympus itself, gods watching mortals suffer for their sins. But the true god was the emperor. When Augustus first sponsored the games, he framed them as restoration, a return to ancestral virtue, a unifying ritual for a fractured people. The amphitheatre, he claimed, was where the empire could gather as one body. He wasn't wrong. The roar of 50,000 voices was unity, not of love, but submission. Later emperors understood the power better than he ever could. Caligula turned executions into personal theatre, choosing the condemned himself, sometimes from the audience. Nero, ever the performer, composed music to accompany the screams. Trajan held the longest festival of all, 123 days of continuous blood, 9,000 animals, 10,000 men. Each ruler sought not merely to punish, but to stage control. Every scream became a note in the empire's anthem. Every corpse, a proof of Rome's invincibility. For the spectators, it was a feast for the senses. Gold glinting on armor, sunlight flashing on blades, the roar of beasts colliding with human panic. But deeper than the thrill was reassurance. To see another body die was to feel your own safety renewed, to witness divine order reaffirmed. It was civic therapy through cruelty. No one called it barbaric. The Romans pitied those who didn't understand. To them, the games were civilization, the triumph of order over chaos. In the same way their armies subdued provinces, the arena subdued the chaos within. Archaeologists later found painted signs above some entrances. "Let the guilty burn, let Rome be purified." A phrase that sounded like worship. It was. Each performance opened with a prayer to Mars or Jupiter, and closed with a hymn of gratitude for justice served. The priests sprinkled the arena sand with blessed water before the first blood was spilled. Sacrifice had not disappeared, it had scaled. This was the true brilliance of Rome's cruelty. It industrialized sanctity. The amphitheatre was a factory of belief, producing obedience in the shape of awe. The audience did not see corpses, they saw symbols. The foreigner punished for rebellion, the traitor silenced, the slave destroyed for disobedience. Every death confirmed a truth the empire depended on, that Rome could not be challenged, and that the gods agreed. At the end of each festival, the city glistened. Streets washed clean, torches replaced, statues garlanded. Children played mock games, pretending to be gladiators. Vendors sold souvenirs carved from animal bones. Even artisans painted frescoes of lions mid-leap, jaws open, muscles taut, beauty in brutality. That was the danger, the aesthetic itself. When something becomes beautiful, it becomes acceptable. Rome had turned death into decoration, cruelty into craft. And yet, behind the applause, there was exhaustion. Senators complained about the cost. Philosophers whispered that the games made citizens dull. A few poets dared to write that the gods had long departed, leaving mortals to worship their own violence. But the machine kept running. It had to. The crowd expected the theatre of control. Without it, Rome might remember what fear felt like. So the blood kept flowing, year after year, emperor after emperor, until even death itself grew predictable. And that was when Roma began to innovate again. If killing was no longer shocking, they would make it beautiful. If cruelty was no longer enough, they would make it art. The next age of the empire would not merely punish or entertain, it would engineer awe, turning the logistics of pain into Rome's grandest masterpiece. The morning light over the Colosseum was not sunrise, it was curtain rise. For the emperors of Rome, the arena wasn't merely a monument, it was a throne, a stage, a mirror reflecting their power. When Augustus took power, he promised peace, but peace required performance. His new games of virtue were staged not to glorify violence, but to demonstrate mercy by selection. A thief spared by imperial gesture, a traitor executed at his nod. The crowd gasped, cheered, and wept, every emotion calibrated by one raised hand. Justice, spectacle, faith. They all merged in a single gaze, his. By the time of Nero, the role of emperor had shifted from ruler to showman. He fancied himself divine, an artist of fear. He chose the condemned personally, often by whim, matching their crimes to creative punishments. A man who stole gold was gilded alive in molten metal. A poet who mocked the court was forced to recite his verses as his tongue was nailed to wood. Nero's cruelty was not madness, it was direction. Each execution carried rhythm, timing, and narrative. The amphitheatre became an open-air cathedral of obedience. Even silence became applause. He introduced a new gesture, the slow turn of the thumb, held midway before dropping down. That single movement controlled 50,000 souls, proof that terror, when aestheticized, could move people more deeply than any sermon. The emperor's box wasn't merely a seat, it was the eye of the storm. Below him, men died as extensions of his will. Around him, senators pretended enthusiasm, their smiles carved in fear. To be seen not clapping was to risk being chosen next. The orchestration was astonishingly efficient. Slaves swept blood away between acts. Trumpeters rehearsed to drown screams at precise beats. Even the sand was raked into perfect patterns before each new round. Rome called it piety. In truth, it was production design. The empire had invented propaganda through emotion. Control, not by decree, but by sensation. Under Trajan, the scale reached its peak. His 123-day games after the Dacian Wars consumed entire economies. Ships loaded with animals from Africa, carpenters and masons from the provinces, thousands of slaves trained for temporary death. The logistics themselves became worship. Historians describe the procession that opened the games. Chariots gleamed in the sun. Painted banners declared, Rome restored. Priests carried incense before cages of panthers. Trumpets blared as Trajan appeared, not in armor, but in white robes. He raised his hand, the crowd fell to its knees. When he dropped it, the beasts were released. That gesture, one downward sweep, summarized the theology of empire, order through annihilation. To the Romans, this was harmony. The blood of traitors washed the empire clean. The applause washed the emperor's conscience. For the audience, awe replaced compassion. They didn't see victims. They saw justice painted in motion. Each roar, each death affirmed the structure of the world. Gods above, emperor beneath them, citizens beneath him, slaves and beasts below all. Everyone had a place. Everyone obeyed. This was why the games endured. They weren't mere distractions. They were reminders. The emperor didn't need speeches. He had choreography. Yet beneath the marble calm, something darker grew. The senators feared the crowd's shifting loyalties. A single gesture of displeasure from 50,000 throats could drown the emperor himself. And so, the ruler had to perform harder. More elaborate festivals, more generous distributions, more creative deaths, to keep his audience convinced that his power was sacred, not fragile. The games became a mirror of the emperor's soul. Each spectacle grander than the last, each cruelty dressed in richer symbolism. A man killed as Orpheus, another as Icarus, a woman mauled as Europa. They weren't merely dying, they were acting out myths, reaffirming Rome's claim to divine narrative. The emperor watched, smiling faintly, as the crowd shouted his name like a prayer. He understood the secret better than anyone. When people cheer for your cruelty, they no longer fear your power, they sanctify it. The arena was not just stone and sand. It was an instrument, finely tuned to play the emotions of an empire. Fear, pity, awe, devotion, all harmonized under imperial direction. Rome had become a symphony of obedience conducted by spectacle, and in that music, mercy vanished. As night fell, the sand turned black with blood and oil. The last bodies were dragged away, leaving marks like brushstrokes across the ground. In the stands, torches flickered. The emperor rose, waved, and left. The crowd exhaled as if dismissed from mass. Tomorrow, the process would begin again. New victims, new stories, new faith to reaffirm through death. The empire had found its perfect rhythm, a calendar built not on harvest or prayer, but on performance. Each festival was both a promise and a warning. Each execution, a renewal of order. And through it all, the emperors learned the most dangerous lesson of power, that to rule a people forever, you don't have to love them. You only have to direct their fear. Terror, in Rome, was never chaos. It was craft. The empire learned to sculpt fear with the same precision it carved marble. Every death had geometry. Every scream, a purpose. By the 2nd century, punishment had evolved into design. The amphitheater was no longer just a venue. It was a machine for emotion. Its corridors were arteries, its trapdoors, lungs, its floor, a stage of sand that drank history. And beneath that sand, Engineers built miracles. Cages that opened by counterweight, platforms that lifted entire forests, mechanical beasts dragged upward on chains to erupt into daylight. From the stands, it looked effortless, divine. But behind the spectacle was calculation, timing, temperature, sound, and psychology. Rome had mastered the logistics of fear. The architects of pain worked in silence, their blueprints stained with blood. They measured shadows to ensure the condemned died under perfect light. They tested animal gaits until the roars emerged at the emperor's cue. Even the deaths were rehearsed. A condemned man would be trained how to enter correctly, to walk, pause, face the sun, and die without turning away. Every motion had to serve the same goal: awe, not pity. It was said that when a lion's cage malfunctioned and the beast mauled its keeper before the show began, the crowd grew restless. Not because a man had died, but because the rhythm had broken. Fear, to work, had to feel organized. That was the Empire's secret. It didn't terrorize by accident. It terrorized by designing perfection. When Emperor Domitian rebuilt the Colosseum after a fire, he demanded that the scent of blood be masked by fragrance. The arena's vents released a mixture of saffron and wine vapor, so even the air of slaughter felt civilized. Witnesses wrote that the scent of the gods drifted through the stands as people watched men die. Others described the sand itself: dyed crimson between acts to hide stains, reshaped into patterns of waves or labyrinths, depending on the story to be reenacted. Every surface whispered that death could be beautiful, if arranged correctly. In one festival, a condemned soldier was made to play Icarus. He was raised high on a wooden contraption with feathered wings. Trumpets sounded. The crowd watched as he flew, before the mechanism collapsed and his body struck the ground in pieces. Children laughed, women gasped. Poets compared it to the fall of pride. The story had been told for centuries. Only Rome had the courage to perform it literally. The Empire had transformed myth into punishment, and punishment into meaning. The purpose was never justice. It was education. Every death carried a lesson. Do not fly too high. Do not betray. Do not forget your place. For those who built the games, the line between art and atrocity disappeared. The stagehands who cleaned blood from the sand whistled hymns. The carpenters who built scaffolds for crucifixions called their work beautiful geometry. One engineer, Marcus Attilius, left an inscription on a rusted pulley: "I built what Rome needed. May the gods forgive the design." He was never punished. He was honored. Because in Rome, to perfect the machinery of pain was service to the state. The cruelty wasn't hidden. It was professionalized. The Roman imagination turned even the body itself into architecture. Torture wasn't chaos. It was choreography. The condemned were arranged, posed, displayed like living statues of disobedience. Crosses lined the roads to the city, each a monument of deterrence, each a silent sermon. There were crucifixions so precisely spaced they looked like colonnades. Travelers would pass them in reverent silence, as if walking through a temple corridor of agony. The executioners were trained to make it last, not to kill quickly, but to sculpt time. Every hour of suffering became another lesson in the Empire's language of order. And yet, behind this perfection, there was a quiet corruption of the soul. Engineers began to compete for innovation, new devices, cleaner mechanics, smoother transitions between acts. One designed a rotating platform so beasts could enter and exit seamlessly. Another invented collapsible cages, faster stage resets. Rome called them artisans. History calls them accomplices. Their genius was moral anesthesia, the ability to build horror and feel pride in its elegance. The empire rewarded them not for cruelty, but for efficiency. To make death flow smoothly was to serve civilization. To ensure the audience never saw the suffering as messy was to keep faith intact. Even the sounds were tuned. Brass horns, rhythmic drum beats, the roar of beasts arriving at the crescendo of an execution. Every sense was engineered. Every shiver in the audience was intentional. And through it all, one truth held. Rome's true power wasn't in its armies or its laws. It was in its ability to turn fear into admiration. When cruelty feels divine, obedience no longer needs chains. Late in the day, when the arena fell silent, slaves swept the sand again. The fragrance lingered. The emperor's box glowed gold in the setting light. No one thought of the men who had died, only of how perfectly it had all been done. Rome had discovered the most dangerous kind of beauty, the kind that makes people forget it's built on screams. They said the games belonged to the gods, but, in truth, they belonged to the crowd. 50,000 bodies pressed into stone, eyes glinting, hearts synchronized to the rhythm of the drums. For every man who died on the sand, thousands were reborn in their seats, purified by the spectacle of someone else's punishment. From dawn until dusk, Rome's citizens filled the amphitheater like worshippers at Mass. Bread was handed out, wine poured freely, incense rose from the altars. The air vibrated with heat, metal, and anticipation. When the gates opened, the roar wasn't just excitement, it was hunger. They came to be reminded of order. Each death reassured them that the world still made sense. Slaves below, citizens above, gods watching. Justice was visible, audible, absolute. A merchant might leave his stall to watch a thief's body torn apart, then return to his business convinced the city was clean again. A soldier might cheer as a deserter burned alive, feeling his own loyalty renewed. Even mothers brought their children to teach them the lesson that law was not an idea, but a sound. The crack of a whip, the cheer of approval, the silence that followed. For the Romans, morality wasn't taught in books. It was learned in blood. Writers of the time tried to capture what it felt like. Seneca, the philosopher, once left the games trembling. I saw innocence mistaken for guilt, and I saw men cheering. He called it madness, but he returned anyway. Because in Rome, refusing to watch was rebellion. Attendance was civic duty. Emperors measured loyalty by participation, not opinion. To stay home on the day of games was to insult the gods, the state, and the emperor himself. So they came, senators, slaves, matrons, children, each adding a voice to the choir of obedience. The crowd was not mindless. They knew cruelty. They smelled death. But Rome had taught them to reframe it, to see in every wound a kind of divine arithmetic. If blood was spilled, then order had been restored. If a man screamed, then a god was satisfied. It was logic disguised as faith, and faith disguised as entertainment. The audience learned to feel pious for their applause. They believed they were part of something sacred, a collective act of purification. And that belief was the empire's greatest invention. Archaeological records show how deeply the crowd's involvement shaped the design. Amphitheaters were built with special tunnels for processions, so spectators could watch victims pass below their feet before execution. Some seats had channels for perfumed smoke, masking the stench of decay. The audience was meant to feel divine distance, close enough to see, far enough to feel absolved. They were witnesses, not participants. Or so they told themselves. But history records something else. When the sand grew dull, when the show dragged, the people demanded more. They called for second rounds, for longer deaths, for poetic endings. Crowds clapped in rhythm as the condemned begged for mercy, until mercy became the least popular emotion in Rome. One inscription from Pompeii, carved into a seat, reads, "I was here when the slave with the broken leg was eaten by lions. The crowd stood for the emperor." It's written like pride, not shame. Another graffiti shows a sketch of a man torn apart, captioned, "He deserved it." You can almost hear the laughter that followed. The arena was not only stone and blood, it was memory. The people carried its echoes home, told stories, reenacted scenes for children. They dreamed of it. They began to measure justice by spectacle, not fairness. Cruelty by creativity, not guilt. Rome had succeeded in doing something no empire before it had achieved. It made the citizens themselves part of the mechanism of control. Every clap, every shout, every raised thumb was a small act of complicity. By turning judgment into ritual, the empire erased moral boundaries. The crowd believed they were celebrating order, but, in truth, they were rehearsing submission. Every cheer was an oath of loyalty, every gasp a renewal of faith. As the sun set and the arena emptied, people left with a strange calm. The world outside felt quieter, safer, more orderly. They had seen justice performed. They had felt its power. That was the genius of Rome's theatre. It didn't need to convince the people to obey. It made them love the feeling of obedience. And long after the bodies were gone, the crowd remained haunted, though not by guilt. They were haunted by silence, the absence of spectacle, the unbearable emptiness of peace. Because once a society learns to worship punishment, it begins to crave it. Justice, to them, no longer meant fairness, it meant noise. Every empire teaches obedience, but Rome taught it through agony. Where other nations built schools, Rome built arenas. Where others taught morality through words, Rome taught it through wounds. The amphitheater wasn't just a stage, it was a classroom. And the lessons it taught sank deeper than philosophy ever could. When the condemned were paraded through the streets, children were told to watch. "See," mothers whispered, "that is what happens when you disobey." The lesson wasn't abstract, it was immediate, intimate, unforgettable. A body writhing on the ground said more than any law ever could. For Romans, punishment wasn't about crime, it was about education. Each execution reaffirmed the chain of command that kept the world in balance. Gods above men, masters above slaves, empire above all. Pain became pedagogy. This doctrine reached into every layer of life. In the army, discipline was ritualized terror. A legion that faltered in battle might be decimated. 1 in every 10 men beaten to death by their comrades, while the others were forced to watch. The logic was simple and absolute. Order born from fear lasts longer than order born from loyalty. In households, slaves were flogged in public courtyards, not in secret. The goal wasn't correction, it was demonstration. A child raised in such a home learned early that control required spectacle, that silence after screams was the sound of authority restored. Even education itself carried echoes of the arena. Roman tutors kept rods by their desks. Students learned literature through bruises, rhetoric through fear of humiliation. The empire that conquered continents through pain also reproduced itself the same way, one small cruelty at a time. The Senate called this discipline virtus, the manly virtue. To endure pain without complaint was a mark of honor. To inflict it without hesitation was a sign of power. Fathers praised sons who watched executions without flinching. Mothers blessed boys who could look at blood and see beauty. Mercy was considered weakness, empathy, disorder. In public life, pity became politically dangerous. A governor who spared too many rebels was accused of treason. A magistrate who hesitated to whip a thief was said to dishonor the law. The gods, they said, demanded balance, and balance required pain. But cruelty alone wasn't enough. The Romans perfected ritualized instruction. They made punishment rhythmic, predictable, almost comforting. Each festival followed the same order: prayer, parade, proclamation, execution, applause. The people knew the sequence by heart. That predictability was its own form of peace, terror with a schedule. Even slaves began to internalize it. Letters from the time describe condemned men walking calmly toward death as if performing a duty. They believed their suffering kept Rome safe. Some even thanked their executioners. That was the final victory of Rome's pedagogy. It taught the condemned to consent. A Roman philosopher once wrote, "To rule the body, you must first rule the imagination." And that was the true power of the empire, not its legions, but its ideas. It conquered the imagination of its people until they could no longer imagine justice without pain. The audience was conditioned to expect cruelty the way others expect prayer. When the emperor delayed the games, riots erupted, not for food, not for freedom, but for the missing lesson of blood. Citizens didn't merely accept violence, they required it. Without public punishment, Rome felt adrift, faithless, impure. Archaeologists have found inscriptions carved by spectators who returned to the arena between festivals. "We wait for justice. May the sand drink again." Those words reveal the deepest truth of all. Rome's order was never sustained by law or gods, but by addiction. The people were addicted to reassurance, the emotional high of seeing chaos punished before their eyes. Every act of cruelty reinforced that high. Every death gave them proof that the empire still worked, that their place in the hierarchy was safe. This was not just control, it was education in complicity. Imagine the silence after a show. The crowd disperses, their sandals scraping over stone. The blood on the sand has dried, the smell of iron replaced by incense. And in that stillness, the lesson lingers, that peace requires pain, that justice requires victims, that survival requires obedience. The Romans didn't simply watch cruelty, they learned from it. And once learned, that lesson was impossible to unteach. That was Rome's genius and its curse. By turning punishment into instruction, it created citizens who mistook submission for order and horror for harmony. It made cruelty the cornerstone of civilization, not as aberration, but as education. And centuries later, when the arenas fell silent, that logic endured, not in marble, but in memory. Because every empire that followed, every court, every scaffold, every prison, inherited Rome's most effective lesson. Pain is persuasive. Justice in Rome didn't just serve the gods, it served the market. Behind every execution, there was a receipt. Behind every drop of blood, a tax. The empire had perfected something terrifyingly modern, the monetization of pain. By the 1st century CE, the amphitheatre wasn't just a theatre, it was an economy. The games required architects, engineers, armourers, beast hunters, shipbuilders, tailors, musicians, and thousands of slaves. Each one earned their coin from death. Every execution meant labour, logistics, and logistics meant money. Documents survive, orders for iron chains, wood for crosses, exotic animals from Numidia, perfumes from Syria, dyes to colour the sand. The empire turned cruelty into commerce. Pain had a price per unit. A lion from Africa cost more than a soldier. A skilled gladiator could earn the state more in a single season than a small farm in Latium. And for the merchants supplying them, death was good business. Ships sailed from Carthage, filled not only with grain, but with cages. Slaves, criminals, and condemned men were branded and shipped the same way as animals. Each bore a tag stamped with their owner's seal, property of the arena, inventory of the gods. When a festival approached, warehouses near the Colosseum overflowed. Iron collars stacked beside amphorae of oil, sand hauled in carts from the coast, torches bundled in hundreds. Even silence was imported. Saffron and myrrh burned to mask the smell of rot. For every body that fell in the arena, hundreds profited in the shadows. The state taxed everything. Meat from slaughtered animals sold in markets afterward. Blood drained for use in cosmetic balms. Proof of vitality, whispered sellers to patrician women. Bones carved into charms for soldiers. Ash mixed into bricks to build more walls. Nothing was wasted, not even the dead. Rome had turned execution into full-cycle production, cruelty as resource efficiency. The gladiators themselves became celebrities, commodities of flesh. Posters painted on walls announced their appearances. Flamma, the undefeated, the favourite of Rome. Merchants sold miniature figurines in his likeness, cups engraved with his victories. Children played mock duels in the streets, shouting his name. Every cheer in the arena was a coin tossed into a system that fed itself. The more they killed, the more they earned. The more they earned, the more they built. The empire's grandeur, its marble, its festivals, its sense of invincibility, was subsidized by suffering. Even the priests found their place in the profit chain. Each festival opened with purification rites, funded by donations. The more blood spilled, the more the people gave. Faith itself became a business model. Inscriptions from Pompeii record divine tariffs, Offerings required for specific blessings: safe childbirth, good harvest, forgiveness for sins. The same gods who demanded sacrifice were paid through fees to the temples that arranged them. It was accounting disguised as worship. And the emperor was the ultimate shareholder. The arenas didn't just glorify his name, they enriched his treasury. The spectacles justified taxes, inspired donations, silenced dissent, and employed thousands. Violence kept the empire profitable. Behind the priests and merchants were the contractors of death, families who specialized in logistics, supplying wood for crosses, oil for lamps, nails for crucifixions. Some grew rich enough to buy senatorial rank. One even inscribed his epitaph proudly, "I supplied the empire with order." He meant wood and iron. But history knows he supplied something else: faith in the machine of control. And there were the lesser profiteers, the tavern owners near the Colosseum selling wine mixed with blood, the vendors hawking charms blessed by gladiators. Outside the arena, the economy thrummed like a second heartbeat, small, steady, invisible. Each life taken echoed in coin. This was the final genius of Rome's system. It hid its exploitation beneath celebration. The empire made people believe they were part of a sacred ritual, when in truth, they were shareholders in an industry of pain. The amphitheater employed the poor, entertained the masses, enriched the state, and sanctified power, all at once. In Rome, cruelty was not a cost, it was capital. At night, when the games ended, slaves dragged carcasses out through the gate of death. Accountants waited nearby with tablets, recording numbers, men, beasts, costs, revenue. The empire's most enduring prayer was whispered not to Jupiter, but to the ledger. Let the balance be kept. And beneath that whisper lay the real theology of Rome. Not faith, not virtue, but profit through spectacle. That's how the empire endured, by disguising economic machinery as moral necessity. Every act of violence was justified as piety, every execution as purification, every tax as tribute to the gods. The result was perfect equilibrium, belief funding blood, blood feeding belief. Rome had built the world's first civilization where pain paid dividends, and it worked, until the day the cost could no longer be counted in coins. By the time the Colosseum's arches glowed gold in the afternoon light, cruelty no longer shocked Rome, it enchanted it. Violence had become Rome's most refined art form, woven into its architecture, its rituals, its sense of beauty. Everywhere you looked, the empire wore death like ornament. Triumphal arches showed enemies kneeling. Mosaics shimmered with images of chained barbarians. Even the public fountains were decorated with sculpted corpses, water flowing gently from open wounds. To the Romans, this wasn't macabre, it was magnificent, because in their eyes, beauty was proof of order, and order was proof that Rome was eternal. The aesthetic of power worked like perfume. It masked the stench beneath. Senators hosted banquets beneath frescoes of battles. Nobles reclined under ceilings painted with scenes of execution. The cruelty that once made people tremble now adorned their homes. Visitors to the imperial palace described marble floors inlaid with gemstones, the color of blood and honey, columns carved from Egyptian porphyry, stone so red it seemed to pulse. The emperor's throne itself sat upon a mosaic of chained figures, each crafted from ivory. Every detail whispered the same truth. Rome ruled not just by force, but by design. The empire understood something dangerously elegant, that control needed to be felt as grace. If punishment looked sacred, people would worship it. If death looked divine, no one would question it. The artists were complicit. Sculptors praised the heroism of dying men. Poets compared executions to sunsets. Pain was translated into pattern, suffering into symmetry. Even public monuments were choreographed to tell a single story. Rome was mercy itself, even as it crushed the world. The inscription on one triumphal arch reads, "To peace made visible through strength." It could have been a prayer or an alibi. Archaeologists have found statues of conquered peoples displayed not as victims, but as ornaments. Arms broken to hold trays, spines arched to support fountains. They weren't hidden in shame. They were displayed in pride. The empire turned its conquered into its furniture, its architecture, its landscape. When you walked through Rome, you didn't just see power, you moved inside it. Every column, every wall, every sculpture whispered that pain could be perfected, that domination could be beautiful. The Colosseum itself became a masterpiece of this aesthetic theology. Its outer ring gleamed white as bone. Its corridors echoed like cathedrals. The amphitheater was not designed to frighten. It was designed to awe. That was the secret. Awe and fear were the same emotion, merely separated by approval. When the emperor entered, the crowd didn't see a tyrant. They saw a god framed in light. When blood spilled, they didn't see cruelty. They saw justice illuminated by the sun. In that choreography of perception, Rome achieved perfection. It made people believe that violence was beauty's highest form. Artists copied the poses of the condemned, the arched back, the tilted head, and turned them into sculptures of saints, heroes, and lovers. Bodies that once convulsed in agony were reimagined as divine ecstasy. The aesthetics of suffering outlived the suffering itself. That is the most chilling part of Rome's legacy. The idea that beauty and brutality can share the same face. That to make something divine, you must first make it bleed. As centuries passed, this belief bled into everything: law, art, religion. Even the early Christians who despised Rome inherited its sense of spectacle. The martyrs who died in the arena were immortalized in paintings, not as victims, but as icons, framed in the same serene compositions the empire used for its gods. Rome taught them, too, how to aestheticize pain. The empire fell, but its vision remained. The conviction that order is more persuasive when it looks exquisite. That terror, if gilded, feels holy. At the height of its glory, Rome no longer needed to threaten anyone. Its monuments did the speaking. Every marble column was a sermon. Every statue a memory of submission turned to stone. Citizens walked beneath arches carved with victories they never fought, past temples built with taxes they never consented to, and felt gratitude. They called it civilization. But it was only decoration, painted over wounds that had never healed. And yet, even as the empire's borders began to crumble, its art remained immaculate, because beauty endures longer than truth. And Rome understood that better than anyone. The aesthetic of power was Rome's final illusion, and its most effective. When people learned to see cruelty as harmony, they stopped resisting. When they learned to see suffering as sacred, they stopped questioning. That was the quiet triumph of the empire. It conquered the human conscience, not with terror, but with taste. By the 3rd century, Rome no longer ruled through conquest. It ruled through conditioning. The empire had learned the most subtle form of domination, to shape the conscience before the sword was ever drawn. From childhood, Romans were taught that obedience was virtue, and virtue was survival. Every ritual, every law, every spectacle had reinforced the same invisible command: yield and live, question and die. In the Roman home, this conditioning began at birth. Fathers held absolute power over their families, the patria potestas, the right of life and death. A newborn was placed at the father's feet. If he lifted it, the child lived. If he turned away, the baby was taken outside to die. No decree, no drama, just the quiet, lawful efficiency of hierarchy. The lesson began before language. Existence itself depended on submission. As children grew, they absorbed obedience like air. They watched slaves whipped, soldiers saluted, mothers kneel before fathers, all framed as natural order. Fear didn't need to roar anymore. It breathed through everyday life, calm, unhurried, absolute. By the time those children became adults, they didn't need the arena to feel fear. They carried it inside them, a private amphitheater built into the mind. They censored themselves before the emperor ever spoke, policed one another before soldiers intervened. Rome had invented the psychology of empire, a system where external control became internal faith. Seneca once wrote, "We have grown so used to chains that we polish them." He meant it as a warning, but it read like prophecy. The Romans didn't feel enslaved. They felt safe. Safety became the highest moral good, and freedom became synonymous with danger. That shift in consciousness was irreversible. When obedience becomes comfort, rebellion feels like sin. This was the genius of Roman power. It taught the mind to love its own restraints. After centuries of ritualized punishment, the people no longer feared authority. They craved it. They saw in law not tyranny, but reassurance. In cruelty, not corruption, but stability. The empire's psychology depended on one emotion above all: relief. Relief that justice had been done. Relief that someone else suffered in their place. Every drop of blood spilled in the arena was a release valve for collective anxiety. Rome had built a society that mistook relief for morality. The philosophers tried to resist. Epictetus, born a slave, warned his students, "No man is free who is not master of himself." But few listened. They preferred the comfort of belonging to something vast and unshakable, even if it devoured them. Because submission, when shared by millions, doesn't feel like humiliation. It feels like unity. And unity is intoxicating. By the late empire, submission had evolved into ritual reverence. Citizens knelt at statues of emperors as if before altars. Soldiers saluted portraits, not people. The emperor's name was sung in hymns. When he spoke, the crowd responded in unison. May he live forever. It didn't matter who he was, cruel, weak, insane. The ritual mattered more than the man. Obedience had replaced belief. The people had become spectators, not just of death, but of their own surrender. In letters from provincial governors, one phrase recurs: "The people ask for judgment. They cannot bear uncertainty. That was the final stage of control, when fear of disorder outweighed fear of oppression. Rome didn't need to silence its citizens. It simply kept them entertained, fed, and certain that someone, somewhere, was being punished. That certainty felt like peace. And once people confuse punishment with order, the empire no longer needs armies to rule them. Inside this psychological architecture, compassion became subversive. To feel pity was to question the justice of the state, and questioning was unthinkable. The games, the laws, the art, all had done their work. The Roman heart had been trained to flinch, not at cruelty, but at chaos. Even mercy had to be authorized. When an emperor spared a life, it wasn't seen as kindness. It was seen as his right to delay inevitability. No one escaped the cycle, not even rulers. Each emperor lived under the same terror he imposed. Applause could turn to outrage in an instant. The people who worshipped power one day could tear it apart the next. The reflex of control turned inward. This was the ultimate cost of Rome's system. It didn't just enslave the conquered, it domesticated the soul. It made fear a habit, obedience a reflex, and silence a virtue. The empire no longer needed cruelty to maintain order. It only needed memory, the collective echo of centuries of spectacle whispering in every mind, "Obey, and you will be safe." Historians later called this the Roman peace. But it wasn't peace. It was paralysis. A civilization so conditioned by terror that it mistook quiet for harmony. The arenas fell silent, yet the pattern endured. Because once obedience becomes identity, it outlives the empire that created it. That is the legacy Rome left to every civilization that came after. The belief that order requires fear, and that submission can feel like salvation. Centuries have passed since the Colosseum's last roar faded, but the blueprint Rome built never really died. It just changed its stage. The marble has cracked, the sand has turned to dust, yet the psychology, that choreography of obedience and awe, still hums beneath our modern world. Because Rome's greatest invention wasn't its roads, nor its legions, nor its law. It was the spectacle of control. Today, the arena has new names. We no longer gather to watch lions tear men apart. We gather around screens. Executions are replaced by humiliation, exile by cancellation, the whip by public outrage. Our blood is digital now, but the reflex is the same: to punish together, to feel pure through someone else's pain. The crowd has not changed. It still wants a villain, a confession, an apology, and finally, silence. We still call it justice. We still applaud when the guilty fall. And when the noise fades, we feel safer, cleaner, more righteous, just as the Romans did. The systems have evolved, but the rituals are familiar. Governments broadcast their trials. Media outlets turn suffering into ratings. Algorithms feed on outrage, each share a grain of sand in a new digital arena. And like Rome, we've learned to disguise fascination as morality. We call it awareness. We call it accountability. But at its core, it's the same ritual: collective purification through spectacle. When Rome's citizens shouted for mercy, the crowd drowned them out. When we see injustice today, we often scroll past until the next performance begins. Even the architecture echoes the old logic. Surveillance cameras replace priests. Courthouses rise like temples, their marble stairs framed for cameras. Power still understands that fear looks most convincing when wrapped in ceremony. Rome taught the world that control is strongest when it feels voluntary, when the people themselves demand the spectacle that keeps them subdued. And we, like them, have learned to mistake participation for power. We share, we react, we perform our outrage. Each click is an offering, each comment a chant. We don't need chains anymore, only attention. But the echo isn't just political, it's spiritual. We still romanticize suffering, the tortured artist, the tragic hero, the noble victim. We still build beauty on pain. And we still confuse order with virtue, silence with peace, spectacle with truth. Rome's aesthetic of cruelty didn't vanish. It was inherited. It lives in art galleries filled with martyrdom, in headlines designed for shock, in every story where violence masquerades as meaning. Sometimes tourists stand inside the Colosseum and whisper, "How could they watch this?" They forget they're standing in the same instinct. The same thrill that once filled those stone arches now hums through fiber optics and screens. The amphitheater never fell, it multiplied. And yet, the lesson Rome left behind isn't hopeless. Its ruins still stand, silent, cracked, emptied of cheers. They remind us that no system of control, no spectacle, no choreography of fear lasts forever. The crowd always tires, the silence always returns. And when it does, the bones begin to speak again. Because history's voice doesn't roar, it whispers. It whispers through stone, through ruins, through our reflection on the glass screens we stare into. What Rome teaches, finally, is not that cruelty endures, but that it transforms. That every time a society worships power as beauty or punishment as virtue, the old empire stirs beneath the surface. The question isn't whether Rome fell. The question is how often we rebuild it. If you value the record, subscribe, because when the ledger closes, the bones still speak.